2, 3.
Before I get into the, I would guess the America Strikes Back at the British invasion, I'd kind of like to give a little history of how did all this great enduring pop music of the mid to late 60s, you know, how did it just come about? Did it just bubble up spontaneously, or was there like a big build up? And you know, some people think that really like the whole 60s culture started when this happened. You know, when the Beatles played the Ed Sullivan Show in the USA. But they don't realize that before they had this huge audience for that show, there was a big build-up. There was a big buzz that was generating from across the Atlantic, from England to the U.S. And of course, you know, U.S. was pretty much the media capital of the world as far as, you know, music and especially Hollywood, the movie business. Even back then, you know, Hollywood movies were pretty much internationally distributed. I have an old Life magazine, and you can see the date there. And it was right before pretty much the Beatles came over here. And of course, Life was like the major broad interest magazine of the time, and they had this picture article on the Beatles. Here come those Beatles. And so, you know, American kids basically had a preview, you know, from looking at this. You can see that there. Of, you know, if all these English kids were getting so excited about this group, you know, then it must be, you know, something worth, you know, taking notice. You could see the fashion change, and that was what people really were looking for. They were looking for a change. They were looking to get out of that whole 50s culture of the prefabricated teen idol. Basically, you know, usually a guy who was usually, you know, great looking, who was basically just like a prefabricated pop star. He wasn't a true artist. He didn't write his own material. He usually didn't play an instrument or know how. But that all changed, really. There were a few American artists, you know, that did, the Buddy Hollies and that, but you know, they passed away because of, you know, tragic accidents and things like that. Elvis was an interpreter. He wasn't really a writer. He was in the army, and then he came out, and then he kind of went Hollywood. But that's a whole different subject. But that was one of the main things. The Beatles, they were a self-contained artistic entity. They wrote their own material. They started out doing covers, but they played their own instruments. It wasn't just like one front guy. It wasn't like, say, John Lennon and the Beatles or Paul McCartney and the Beatles. It was just the Beatles. And other factors too that caused this explosion of new groups. First of all, it was the idea of a group, but then there was also things that changed radio and the media towards this kind of music. Back in the late 50s, the first portable radios, transistor radios. The transistor was kind of a new invention. Came along, but at first they were rather expensive. But then later, when Japan started producing the transistor components in cheaply and started making radios, any kid with their paperboy money or gift money could usually go out and buy, you know, something like this. It's just an AM only radio, and they probably sold back then for anywhere from, oh, $7 to $8, $9, $10. And this one I kind of reconditioned. It still works, but that changed radio. Before, um, you know, radio was something that you listened to at home. You usually had to share your parents' taste in radio because didn't have your own to take with you, or they had one of those old console, the early stereo systems with the TV and the record player and the radio. But of course, you know, if your parents were watching Jack Benny or Gunsmoke, well, you couldn't listen to, you know, that local AM top 40 station at the same time. But with the advent of something like this, you could take your own taste in music with you. This was sort of, I guess you could call this like the iPod of like 1964, really, because it really changed radio. It found a whole different audience with kids or teenagers at that time. Another thing that caused all these American groups too was when they took notice of the Beatles and their star power, a lot of past musicians kind of changed their style. A lot of them were folk musicians who decided to go electric. We're not going to talk about Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is kind of a pretty broad subject, but that's basically what I'm going to. These factors caused this big change in the industry. Another big change was the kind of the gradual shift of the music business in the U.S. from the East Coast to the West Coast. A lot of the folk musicians, they worked out of the East Coast, but with the advent of rock and of electric guitars, or when they went electric, they gradually, many of them moved to the West Coast, and we had a gradual shift of the whole music business, really, from New York to Los Angeles, the West Coast, and San Francisco. The San Francisco groups a few years later. So I have a few records here. I'm going to have to make this a two-part series. But let's get into it. First one is the one that I played that little intro. I showed this. Young Rascals, they were one of the first combos, I guess, to challenge or to get back a share of the top 40. The actual first band, I guess, that knocked the Beatles out of the top 5 or something was the Beau Brummels. Now, I don't have any Beau Brummels records, but I want to give them an honorable mention because they kind of took that sort of formula of the Beatles and adapted it as far as, you know, the electric, you know, 1 or 2 lead guitar, a bass, a rhythm guitar, maybe a frontman lead vocal, and a drummer. As far as other bands, some of the surf bands of California, they kind of started writing material too and started being like a vocal band, and probably the most well-known one was the Turtles. This is their greatest hits record, and it was on the very small White Whale label, LA label. And then you had other people who had been producers or whatever, and they started just forming groups or whatever, and one of those was Sonny and Cher, and they had that huge smash, overnight smash. And this is the album with the famous "I Got You, Babe" single, and they kind of had that folk rock thing going that really hit big in the mid '60s, like '65. You had some other regional ones too. This kind of guy is kind of an honorable mention. He did a lot of covers, but he was like out of Detroit, I believe. This is Mitch Ryder. And he was kind of, I don't know if you call him a one-hit wonder, but he, you know, he had like a little flash of fame there. Maybe a couple years later, you had some regional bands, and some of these bands, they would take, like, they would name themselves with an English-sounding name, so people might have thought they were English. I don't know. Um, or they started their name with the letter B or something, so they'd be close to the Beatles in the record racks at the record store. This one was the Buckinghams, and they were pretty big in the Midwest. Like they were from Chicago, the Chicago area. Some other ones here. Here's Billy Joe Royal. He had kind of a white soul kind of sound. Now here's a guy from the West Coast, I pretty much think, and he was pretty popular in the mid '60s. You had Johnny Rivers. Johnny Rivers in action. Here's another one. Secret Agent Man. Kind of capitalizing on the whole James Bond kind of movie, the spy movie thing that was super huge back in the mid '60s. Here's another Golden Hits package. Now these guys kind of predated the Beatles, but they were still hitting pretty big through the '60s. The Righteous Brothers. Let's see there. Here's another band. I can't recall where they're from, if they're from the US or maybe from Australia. I might get them confused with another group, I'm not sure. The Outsiders. They had a big hit called Time Won't Let Me. And there were even like the odd big novelty records out there too. This one was kind of like a takeoff of the music of like the 20s, and this was like all over the radio, I remember, when I was a kid. It was Winchester Cathedral by the New Vaudeville Band. So, I mean, you had stuff like that capitalizing on the whole the English fascination with England back then. I'm going to finish this part one with a couple. These guys this guy started as a folkie, and he formed this band, and they were really, they kind of were a harbinger of the whole shift from New York to LA as far as the music business goes, because they moved there and they kind of symbolized the whole LA thing. And it was the Mamas and the Papas. You had the great singers. You had Michelle Phillips. You had Mama Cass Elliott. Here's another one. I think these were their first two albums. I'm not quite sure. But I'm going to end this part one with that. And in part two, I'll have a lot of other great groups. And it kind of showed the harbinger of the whole folk rock thing. Because, like I said, a lot of these performers, they had the musical and the writing chops to basically get back a lot of share of the record buying public after Beatlemania, the Beatlemania of 1964, and into early '65. By mid '65, that's when a lot of these records came out. So I hope you stay tuned for part two.